Admiral Ellis, thank you very much for your fantastic presentation. Could you elaborate a little on the cost of producing existing generation of nuclear energy compared to other sources of energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. And one of the things that you get into the economics, and it's always a question of how you measure it. But because the nuclear enterprise has long been depreciated, there's no, and the plants have essentially all been paid for from a fuel operation perspective. Nuclear is competitive, okay, in that context. But new nuclear is not. And when you levelize it with the subsidies, nuclear is on a par, can be on a par with coal. Again, it depends on how one measures it. But they've got, all the amortization of the enterprise has been taken into account. But that's not true for new nuclear. I mean, new nuclear is hugely capital intensive. It's one of those things that, in the face of comparisons between natural gas plants and nuclear plants, there is no comparison. I talked about the time of construction, but also the costs of construction. So nuclear is more costly over the long term. And as I mentioned earlier, the operational skill set, some of it driven by regulatory oversight, and I'm not arguing that that's inappropriate. When it takes 600 to 700 people of highly skilled folks to operate a commercial nuclear plant versus 30 for a combined cycle gas plant, you're not going to be you're not going to be able to beat that price comparison. So that's where, how do we cost in the other advantages, the emissions-free capability, the baseload generation, the grid stability impact? Those things have to be fairly done. I'm not arguing pro or con. My answer is we need all of this. We need as much of the renewables as we can possibly get, and we need the ability to store them over the long term. Remember, too, and I'm digressing from your question a bit, that while we have the ability through pump storage and other technologies at about an 80% efficiency to store renewable technology, we don't have the ability to store it seasonally. We can do it overnight. You can, through lithium-ion batteries and even flow batteries and the like, maybe get it for a couple of days or a week. But how do you deal with the seasonal variations? How do you deal with the drought situations that dramatically decrease your hydroelectric capacity? A few years ago, when I was at INPO, the Tennessee Valley Authority lost 50% of their hydro generation capability due to a drought in Alabama and North Georgia. So how do you deal with those kinds of realities too when you're looking at a broader energy mix? These are important questions. But ultimately, if it's short-term cost, nuclear does not fare as well as other options. But I think over the long term, there are ways in which that playing field can be leveled. You monetize the advantages that it can bring to a nuclear strategy, and you'll see much more parity in that. Yes, sir.
Hello. Did 9/11 make the nuclear market uncompetitive with its regulations that put on the market?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Did September 11th, the terrorist attack, did that make the nuclear market uncompetitive?
No, one of the things that people talk about is the security piece for nuclear power plants. I think that's what you're getting to. You may not be aware, but the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in certifying new nuclear reactor designs, requires that they be designed for a fully fueled airliner to fly into the containment dome. There aren't any other elements of our national infrastructure that are built to those standards. If I ever wanted to hide somewhere for the coming zombie apocalypse, I would go to a commercial nuclear plant. I mean, they are as well guarded and as well defended as any infrastructure. They're better defended than any infrastructure in the country. I mean, if you want vulnerabilities, take a look at the grid someday. The balkanized construction, the fragility of it, the uncertainty where, a tree branch, as we saw some decades ago in the Northeast, can cascade and create a blackout. I mean, there's real vulnerabilities there, and I'm not trivializing it, but from a security perspective, and that's part of the costs associated with nuclear plants. Back to the question we got earlier, these are professional security forces. They're very rigorously tested and evaluated. There are force-on-force drills where they put laser tag kind of devices on them. They have special groups from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that use former Special Operations Forces to attack, and the security forces have to be able to respond effectively. So they're very, very well defended. Plus, there's the reality that if you're worried about the theft of nuclear fuel, have you ever seen what a nuclear reactor looks like? I mean, if you're going to unbolt the head, take that thing off, and get the fuel out, you better know what you're doing. Now, it is fair to say that there's some in the spent fuel pool that is perhaps less rigorously defended by massive pieces of metal. But the fact of the matter is, the security issue is the least of our concerns, in my view, from the nuclear perspective. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Oh, I see.
And that's causing too much cost.
Yeah, I think.
Should I say that for the record?
No, that's again, I'm not shilling for the industry. I was one of those guys that used to evaluate them, and they didn't always like what I had to say, But I think that's part of the mitigation strategy that they're beginning to look at now, is how much of that is really necessary, and can we not eliminate it, but reduce it to a more appropriate level? That's a fair question. I'm sorry I misunderstood.
So I go to the University of Michigan, and I took an energy class. We had alumni come speak off the record every week. And we had someone come from a big energy company that, if I said the name of, you'd be very familiar with. They had a plan, huh?
Exelon?
No, not that big.
Okay.
But they had a plan. They had a plan to build a CANDU reactor, and they had a plan to be in the black. They had the capital raise, which is no small feat. And they basically said that the NRC and INPO, to be frank, jerked their chain around for so long that they couldn't feasibly go through with it. And that was kind of the repeat story that alumni in the energy sector tell, is that the NRC and INPO make the uncertainty of building a plant, especially given like you were talking, the capital costs are the real determinant. So if there's uncertainty in that process, it's just not viable.
Well, part of the challenge, and again, I'll take INPO off the table, because INPO doesn't have anything to do with approving construction or anything. It only evaluates operating plants. So, but the NRC, it's interesting, and again, back to the cost issue, the NRC is a government agency, okay? But do you think it's funded out of the budget? No. 10% of their money comes from the national budget. 90% is funded by the industry that they regulate. In other words, if you get into trouble and they come and inspect you, busloads of NRC inspectors, you're paying for all of that. If you want to license a new plant or a new technology, you have to pay the NRC to do that. And if it's brand new technology, then the NRC may not have the expertise to fully understand and appreciate it. So that's part of the regulatory dynamic as well, and that too contributes to delays and costs. There's no doubt about it. And the NRC wrestles with that. We had former NRC commissioner out here a couple of years ago that talked about how they're working to streamline their process, but we're not there yet, and that's a fair point.
Hi, I was just curious. You mentioned that even spent fuel cells still had around 95% of the energy left in them, and that some countries were reprocessing them. Why are we not? Is it just a cost, or is it a safety concern? Could you elaborate on that a little bit more?
Sure. No, it's a good question. And in the late 70s, President Carter said that we would not reprocess fuel. When you reprocess fuel, even though I the slide, what you get out of it is you get the actinides out, the poisons, the bad things. They come out, they're a very small percentage. And then you get a nearly pure stream of plutonium and uranium. Now that's a proliferation risk. So there's a proliferation risk by doing this. But when you visit the French reprocessing facility in Le Hague, as I have, it's just down from Normandy, as a matter of fact, they're using Westinghouse technology that they bought from us, okay, to do this. And they do it as a global industry. They take the spent fuel, they reprocess it, they sent the clean stuff back and the poisons back to the people that sent them, and they're making money out of it. And so Ronald Reagan did away with the proscription against reprocessing in the early 80s when he became president. But the last point you raised is the key one. Who's going to pay for this? why do I need to pay to reprocess if in fact uranium is as cheap as it is? Why? I mean, I'm just going to keep buying new stuff rather than recycle the old, because recycling costs so much more. Somebody has to build these plants, somebody has to operate these plants, somebody has to safeguard from proliferation concerns and the like. So there is a cost associated with doing this that we've never bought into in this country. So it's not that we can't, it's just that we don't, because the U.S. industry says, hey, wait a minute, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to buy new fuel. It's much cheaper for me to do that than it is to reprocess the old, even though it still has that 95 to 97% of the energy still in it. Lady in the back, in the center. Which one? Sorry. That one. All right, we'll get. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for being here with us today. I was wondering if you could elaborate more on the uranium mining processes in the States as an important part of the supply chain for nuclear power plants. What are the potential other consequences of securing that supply?
Okay, I'm sorry I missed you're talking about uranium mining, and
Yes.
too many years around jet airplanes. I don't hear as well as I used to, so.
No, but where's the uranium come from in the
I see.
U.S.?
Yeah,
and
good.
what are the consequences of mining that?
A lot of our uranium is available around. For years, interestingly enough, we downblended Russian nuclear weapons fuel in a megatons to megawatts program, and we downblended it to low enrichment and actually burned Russian nuclear weapons material in our commercial nuclear reactors. So that was one source of it. Uranium mining happens in Canada, it happens in Australia, it happens some in Africa as well. And so there's a market there. The uranium price has been relatively low, actually, and that's why nobody's interested in reprocessing as long as the uranium price is so low. And it also gets back to what I talked about in terms of security of fuel supply, in that it's available from, despite the current tensions with Canada, I don't think they're likely to invade us or close the border anytime soon. And so, that kind of option, when you go up and visit their plant, their mines, as I have, I mean, there's a lot of supply there. And then there's a formal reprocessing piece that it goes through. Now, the enrichment piece is getting interesting. There's a middle ground to that. You don't take uranium out of the ground unless you're burning it in the Canadian-designed reactors, the can-do reactors, they call them. They actually burn basically dirt with uranium in it. It's a very different technology than what we've employed, and in some ways more complex. But other than that, you've got to go through an enrichment process, and that's where the U.S. industry has lost some of its initiative, and a lot of that's now being done in China and Russia and elsewhere. And so that's probably going to be the next concern we've got. Didn't have time to talk about it here. Is where do we get the enrichment capability? We have Urenco and others have plants in New Mexico. We know how to do this. We just haven't scaled it up and can't compete with the prices as with many other materials that are being met or offered by other entities around the world. But it's much less than it's not the Straits of Hormuz kind of problem or that we've dealt with in other parts of the energy sector. The lady in blue now, thank you.
Thank you. Could you please provide some comments on the effectiveness or the ineffectiveness of the Iranian nuclear deal?
Oof. No, that's a, look, I'm a great student of history. Well, I'm not a great student. I'm a student of history because I like it. Now, whether I'm great or not, that's somebody else's to judge. But I think it was Winston Churchill that once said, jaw is better than war. And meaning, hey, we ought to be talking. We ought to be negotiating. Clearly, there are elements to the deal that served us well in terms of access and visibility and transparency and the like. The concerns that people are voicing about the expiration date on that, I think, is legitimate. I think, the idea of what do we do between now and then is a real concern. But hey, if the choice is, do we sign the deal or do we, start dealing proactively and kinetically with capabilities inside Iran, I'm in favor of the deal, and then give it time to play out. My view is that the deal will give us information and insights that we would not have otherwise had. It's the most intrusive inspection regime that has been created by the IAEA and the United Nations. B, it'll give us time to shape a coalition and consider alternative strategies and plans going forward, and see if if there's an inevitable outcome to something, kicking it down the road 10 years gives you more time to deal with it. We're not going to know exactly what we deal with. When I used to lecture at the war colleges, I would tell them, hey, you're going to plan for 100 contingencies, and fate will deal you the 101st. That's the way life is. But the planning is not wasted. You'll be able to then reassemble very quickly that to deal with the new situation with which you're confronted. So overall, I was supportive of the issue with its limitations. I understand. Now, I do think we should have not allowed it to be downscoped. In other words, when it was originally discussed, we talked about a much broader prohibition, eliminating their capability. What we did was dramatically shrink their capability to enrich. We didn't eliminate it. What we did was try and link the overall threat from ballistic missiles and the like. That got kind of written out as well when it became clear that that was a non-starter. So you could argue about the execution of it, but overall, I was supportive.
My question has to do with spent fuel storage, and I know you said that other countries have solved that problem better than we have. And from some things I read, I know Sandia Laboratory is working on some of that technology, but I was wondering what's holding us back from other countries. Is it technology that we're not aware of or research that we haven't done?
No, I don't think so. I think our challenge is the volume of the stuff, okay? It's hard for us to kind of put it in context, but anybody know how much spent fuel there is in the United States that's being stored? Let me give you a schematic. If you think about a football field and stack all the spent fuel on it to a height of 12 feet, that's it. That's it. Okay, that's how much. Now, if you did that, you're going to get a nuclear reaction. So don't do that. But my point here is that in terms of volume, it's not that large. Okay, what's the issue is not the volume. The issue is the heat and the like. And to be fair, if you reprocess and take those actinides out, those actinides are still pretty hot. They're the nasty stuff. So you're still going to have to deal with the heat burden and the heat load and those kind of concerns, but the volume could shrink dramatically. In terms of other nations, they have much less of a volume to deal with. When you go to Finland and places like that, they fairly innovatively, because they built their reactor on a solid bedrock, they've actually dug underneath and made arrangements to store their fuel under the reactor where it's burned. So you lose the transportation requirements, the things that can complicate life, as you might imagine if you're driving spent fuel. But it's also true that after 4 or 5 years in a fuel pool, the fuel is cool enough, and it's now being stored in dry cask storage on dry land in what look like sewer pipe culverts, concrete on it. They're much more complex and sturdy than that, but they're being stored in above ground. That can give you an interim storage capability for 100 years. I don't think we ought to wait that long. I think there are people, thoughtful, meaningful, and interested people who could support nuclear if you could tell them, what are you going to do with this stuff? Rather than trust me, we'll figure it out in 100 years. And I think that's why we've got to move. I think it's a confidence issue that we know how to do this, and that's where the uncertainty comes in. And I think that contributes to some degree to the lack of support for it globally. Go ahead.
So I have 2 questions. First of all, about the modular reactors, seems to me like modular reactors are the future of nuclear energy in the US, given that large-scale reactors can be challenging, politically speaking. But there is sort of a social downside to modular reactor, which is that they have to be close to neighborhoods that they serve, and that can lead to social acceptance issues. How do you foresee that happen?
That's true. We had a seminar here a couple of years ago that I put on for Secretary Shultz on small modular reactors, and the advantages are some that I touted earlier. They can be manufactured in this country in shipyards or other places, whereas we don't have the capability to do large nuclear reactors in this country anymore. I mean, we don't. The steel industry's gotten out of that business. We don't have the forgings. We don't have the ability to mill them. So we can't build large-scale nuclear reactors. So there's that piece of it. The idea that they could be turned out in an assembly line fashion could drive the cost down. And so there's lots of advantages. But your point is a good one. By their design, SMRs, small modular reactors, are designed, you can buy them one or two at a time. In other words, part of the challenge with a large nuclear reactor is the first of a kind. The overnight costs are huge. You know, $5 billion, $6 billion, depending on who you talk to. Whereas these you can buy and get an immediate, much more immediate return. So you can start getting useful revenue out of these things at a much, and then expand. You buy two, then you buy two more. Pretty soon you got a six-pack. And they all are ganged together. They're below grade, they're buried, so security is much less of a concern. But as I mentioned in those last slides, we got to deal with the reality of political acceptance. Now, I do think that there's some change afoot. I mean, when you ask the question in surveys, 65% of American people support nuclear energy. Now the question is it NIMBY? Is it not in my backyard? And those are fair questions. Ironically, the highest level of support is around the nuclear power plants we have. When you think, well, that doesn't make much sense. Well, yes, it does. I mean, they don't know what goes on out there at the site, but they know, you know, their kids go to school with the guy and the lady who works there. They understand how committed they are. So actually, once people understand what it's capable of, they're quite fine with it. The other piece that is a difficult conversation is the one I shared with you, which is the mortality facts of this. I mean, you know, nuclear energy since 1979, from 1979 to 2009, by credible peer-reviewed analysis, have avoided 1.8 million deaths because we weren't burning coal or anything else to put the particulates into the air. We put 2.5 billion metric tons of stuff in the air every year in this country from burning fossil fuels to create electricity. I don't care what your views are on global warming or climate change or anything. That's just not healthy, okay? And so avoiding those kinds of things are huge. So we have to have that more comprehensive conversation. And the fact that the SMRs are all passive designs. I mean, they're walk-away safe, where you literally don't have to rely on anybody to do anything. You can actually turn and walk away and the thing shuts itself down. Those kinds of things will require a lot more understanding, but it's not going to be an easy conversation. But I think generationally, people are beginning to understand the value that nuclear can bring to an overall solution or approach to dealing with global warming and climate change. And I think that's a positive over the long term.
Just touching on the topic about a public discourse, how would you set up something that would create a climate for a public discourse on comprehensive energy policy? Because that's obviously the challenge you're describing, you know, not in my backyard or various things like that, or misunderstanding of nuclear power, even though you suggest there's a strong support for it. You know, as a homeowner seeing solar panels going on houses, being told that they're going to have their own power plant in their backyard, but you want to get a discussion going, and how would you do that?
Well, you know, there are some things that I believe that, you know, government can't do everything, but I do believe that the precursor to this conversation needs to have some, support from, you know, the Department of Energy and the like, and they've worked at it. They've got outreach programs. They've got Secretary of the Energy Advisory Boards that have talked positively about all of this and the like. But, you know, that isn't getting it done. I do believe that at some point we're going to have to deal with some of the painful realities that I talked about here in terms of where we're going with you know, greenhouse gases and the trends that we're seeing. What's going to be necessary to deal with this? We talked about 2 degrees warming, and the reality is we're not going to get close to holding ourselves at that level with the plans that we've got now. And so how do we set that up? I mean, policy discourse is difficult. That's part of the reason we're doing this boot camp. But I think that's the key. Where do you have this conversation? And I think part of it has to start with leadership at the top. I don't think that we can rely on the groundswell of support or Silicon Valley startups or certainly the energy industry itself to fly in the face of shareholder demands and expectations and the like, and buy into future nuclear over the objections. I mean, there has to be a broader understanding, and I think that's where think tanks can help. I think informed dialogue can help, but that's the challenges of all policy discussions, whether it's healthcare, whether it's energy, whether it's financial policies and the like. Where do you begin the conversation? And I wish I had a better answer for you, Jim. Okay, I think that's it. We're done. Okay. Thanks very much. All right. Thank you. Thank you.